Ever meet someone who seems to hate everyone? Here's the truth. They're not the villain in this story. They're the wounded hero who learned that people hurt and their brain decided that staying away was the only way to survive. This is the psychology of people who hate people. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people you can't stand. It's not the quiet solitude of an empty room, it's the grinding, exhausting weight of existing in a world full of faces that irritate you, voices that grate on your nerves, and personalities that feel like sandpaper against your soul. You know the type. Maybe you are the type. The person at the party standing in the corner, not because they're shy, but because they genuinely care and bear another conversation about someone's weekend plans or their opinions on the latest streaming show. The colleague who eats lunch alone, not out of sadness, but out of preference, because the alternative is sitting through another tedious discussion about nothing that matters. But here's the thing. People who hate people aren't the simple misanthropes we make them out to be. They're not cartoon villains, twirling mustaches in dark rooms. They're complex, often wounded, sometimes brilliant individuals navigating a world that feels fundamentally incompatible with how they're wired and their psychology. It's far more fascinating and heartbreaking than you might think. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people who hate people have very good reasons for it. They've been burned, betrayed, disappointed so many times that their nervous system has basically said, you know what, we're done here. Humans are officially classified as threats. It's not hatred in the pure sense, it's self-preservation, wearing a hostile mask. Think about the child who learned early that people are unpredictable and dangerous. Maybe their parents were volatile. Maybe they were bullied relentlessly at school, while adults looked the other way. Maybe they trusted someone completely, opened their heart like a book, and watched as that person used every page against them. These experiences don't just create memories, they reshape the architecture of the brain, hardwiring a deep suspicion of human connection. Psychologists call this attachment trauma, and it's devastatingly common among people who identify as misanthropes. When you're young and your primary caregivers, the people biologically designed to make you feel safe instead, make you feel afraid or worthless or invisible, something fundamental breaks in your ability to trust. Other people stop being potential sources of comfort and start being potential sources of pain. And your brain, trying desperately to protect you, begins treating all humans like loaded guns. But trauma is only part of the story. Some people who hate people are actually suffering from a profound mismatch between who they are and what society expects them to be. They're introverts in an extroverted world, deep thinkers in a culture of small talk, sensitive souls in an environment that rewards thick skin and shallow optimism. Imagine being someone who processes the world at a different frequency than everyone else. You notice things others miss, the micro-expressions, the subtle cruelties disguised as jokes, the emptiness behind polite conversations. You can see how much of human interaction is performance, and it exhausts you. Not because you're superior, but because you can't unsee it. You can't participate in the theater when you're too aware of the props and scripts. This is where introversion gets confused with misanthropy, but they're not the same thing. Introverts need to recharge alone. Misanthropes actively dislike being around others. Yet many people who hate people started as sensitive introverts who were repeatedly punished for their nature, told to speak up, be more social, stop being so serious. Eventually, the frustration curdles into something darker. It's not that they hate people, exactly. They hate what people demand of them. They hate the constant pressure to be someone they're not. Then there's the intellectual angle, and this is where things get really complicated. Some of the most brilliant minds in history were notorious misanthropes. Schopenhauer, who basically built a philosophy around pessimism. Nietzsche, who observed how differently individuals behave compared to groups. Tesla, who preferred the company of pigeons to humans. These weren't just grumpy geniuses. They were people whose minds worked so differently, processed information so uniquely, that normal social interaction felt like being forced to communicate in a language they didn't speak. When you can see systems and patterns and connections that others can't, Regular conversation can feel painfully superficial. Why discuss the weather when you're contemplating the nature of consciousness? Why engage in gossip when you're trying to solve actual problems? But here's the trap. This intellectual isolation often creates a feedback loop. The smarter or more different you feel, the more you distance yourself from others. The more you distance yourself, the less practice you get at connecting. The less you connect, the more alien other people seem. Eventually, you're re-looking at humanity from such a distance that they stop seeming like individuals and start seeming like a disappointing collective noise, irrational and unbearably tedious. Depression and anxiety play massive roles here too, though we rarely talk about them in the context of misanthropy. When you're depressed, the world loses its color. People become exhausting obligations rather than sources of joy. Every social interaction requires energy you simply don't have, and resentment builds like sediment in a river. You start avoiding people, not because you hate them, but because you can barely manage yourself, and somewhere along the way, avoidance transforms into aversion. Social anxiety works differently, but ends up in a similar place. When every interaction triggers your fight-or-flight response, when you replay conversations for hours afterward, cataloging everything you might have said wrong. When you can physically feel people judging you, even when they're probably not well, eventually, it's easier to just write. People off entirely. Hatred becomes armor. If you hate them first, their rejection can't hurt you. And then there's the defense mechanism aspect that psychologists love to explore: projection. Sometimes people who hate people are actually people who hate themselves. They look at humanity and see reflected back all the qualities they despise in their own mirror: weakness, pettiness, selfishness, mediocrity. It's too painful to confront these things internally, so they externalize them, turning their self-loathing outward into a general contempt for the species. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to be worth examining. The person who rants about how stupid everyone is might be terrified of their own intellectual inadequacies. The one who complains that people are fake might be wrestling with their own authenticity. The cynic who trusts no one might be someone who can't trust themselves. But let's not pathologize this entirely, because here's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the people who hate people are just paying attention. They're watching the news and seeing the cruelty humans inflict on each other. They're observing how quickly people form tribes and demonize outsiders. They're witnessing the environmental destruction, the political tribalism, the casual cruelties of everyday life. And they're making a rational assessment. Humanity, collectively, is kind of terrible. This is philosophical misanthropy, and it's different from psychological misanthropy. It's not about personal wounds or social difficulties. It's about taking a hard, honest look at the human condition and finding it wanting. It's the person who loves their dog more than most people because their dog has never started a war, destroyed a forest for profit, or been cruel for entertainment. The tragedy is that people who hate people are often trapped in a paradox they can't escape. They need connection just as much as anyone else. Wears social animals, hardwired for belonging, but they've built such high walls that genuine connection becomes nearly impossible. They're lonely but can't stand company. They crave understanding but trust no one enough to be vulnerable. They see the worst in people, partly because they're looking for it, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And society doesn't help. We don't have much patience for misanthropes. We tell them to get over it, to be more positive, to give people a chance. We treat their perspective as a defect to be fixed rather than a response to be understood. This just drives them further into isolation, confirming their belief that people don't really get it, that vulnerability is punished, that it's safer to be alone. The path out, if there is one, isn't about forcing connection or fake positivity. It's about finding small, safe ways to challenge the narrative. Maybe it's one person who proves trustworthy. Maybe it's therapy that helps rewire those trauma responses. Maybe it's simply time and healing. Or maybe it's accepting that some people will always be a little separate from the crowd, and that's okay too. Because in the end, people who hate people aren't monsters. They're humans dealing with their own pain in the only way they know how, by keeping everyone else at arm's length. And maybe buried underneath all that hatred and cynicism and exhaustion. There's just someone who wanted to connect, but learned, again and again, that connection comes with a price too high to pay.